So we'd like to welcome everybody for joining us today for another Society of Certified Senior Advisors educational webinar. Today we are joined by Hazel Heckers. Hazel is the victim advocate for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Identity Theft and Fraud Investigations Unit. She specializes in issues of grief and loss, crisis intervention, and trauma recovery. She is an advocate counselor and resource for crime victims and their families. Her presentation today, Abuse in Later Life, will provide a brief overview of abuse in later life, touching on caregiver abuse, abuse by family, and the frequency of domestic violence. Hazel, I'm going to pass the presentation over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks Erica. I'm glad you all could join us, and I will be giving you my contact information right here. My phone number, this is my direct number to my desk, as well as my email address. If I don't answer all of your questions, or if you'd like to talk some more after the presentation, feel free to either drop me an email or give me a call, and I'll be more than happy to talk with you. And Erica can provide you with this information if you didn't come prepared to write anything down. So I want to start out just by being a little bit clear about what we mean when we talk about abuse in later life. First, to be very clear that 1 hour is not a lot of time. And this subject is so broad and so huge that we could talk about it for days and days on end. And we actually do have conferences that go 2, 3, 4 days long, and we still have not done more than touch the iceberg, tip of the iceberg in elder abuse. So this will just be an overview, but like I said, any specific questions, feel free to call me anytime. So in Colorado state law, and I know some of you are coming to us from other states, each state will vary. I don't know what other states are online, so I just went with Colorado. In Colorado, we have an at-risk adults law that up until this year, the age that a person was considered an adult is 60 years of age. After July 1st of this year, we've increased that to 70 years of age. Part of the reason that increase happened here in Colorado is that we now have mandatory reporting of elder abuse, and we felt that we needed to change that age to reflect who true seniors were in our community. So one of the things that is one of my pet peeves is that crimes that are committed against our older population are referred to as abuse. And to me, the term abuse minimizes the criminal nature of the act. When you say that someone abused you, it's a little bit less impactful than saying someone assaulted you, or someone sexually assaulted you, or someone attempted to kill you. Those are terms that are a little bit more forceful and truthful about what happened than the term abuse. So I like to refer to crimes against the elderly instead of abuse of the elders. So when we talk about elder abuse or older adult abuse, there's a couple of things that I want you to consider. Now, this is something that we can't do as a game since we're doing a webinar, but I would encourage you just to think about this on your own. What kind of stereotypes do you have about who the older adults are who will be abused? And I think that we all have those stereotypes. For some people, they may believe that that's a person who's physically or mentally ill, someone who has maybe a lot of resources or very few resources, someone who doesn't have friends, who doesn't have a spouse. So when you think about those people, you may know that that's not really the truth, and that anybody who is an older adult or person with a disability could become a victim of these kinds of assaults. One of the things I like to always do with people is to play this game called When I Grow Old. And you can do this with yourselves at any time. And just think about some of your daily activities and how they would be different if you were old. And I think that what you'll find is that what most people say is, oh, you know, old people eat really squishy foods that don't have a whole lot of flavor, and sex life, what are you talking about? No sex life there. And they probably have to take a taxi or get their kids to drive them everywhere they go. But when you think about yourself growing old, you think, well, I like Mexican food now. I'm going to like Mexican food when I'm old. I like to eat carrots now. I'm going to like them when I get old. I hope I have an active sex life until the day I die. I intend to keep my car, and when I can't have my car, I'm going to ride my Harley. So, we think about ourselves as being very active and healthy, and other people as being those frail elders. I also encourage people to think about, what do you think causes elder abuse? Do you think it's bad seed criminal kids? Do you think it's elders who, when they were younger, were nasty themselves? What do you think causes elder abuse, and how does that play into the stereotypes that you have about the people that you interact with every day? This person could not possibly be a victim because of this, or I bet this person's a victim because of that. And you might find that you're wrong a lot of the times whenever you're working off of a stereotype. So here are some examples of the types of crimes against the elderly or elder abuse that I'll talk about today. There's financial exploitation and identity theft. There's caregiver abuse, domestic violence in later life, caregiver domestic violence, early inheritance syndrome, exploitation of assets, and this is assets other than money. And then there's self-neglect. I won't talk about self-neglect too much today, but just want people to be aware of the fact that it is there and is often something that's an indicator of some other form of abuse that's going on in the person's life. And you might wonder why I put financial exploitation first. Part of the reason that I did that is that financial exploitation is usually the first form of elder abuse that we see. It's the one that gets reported most often. It's the one that is kind of the trigger that's indicative of more abuse and other types of abuse going on in a person's life. So what is financial exploitation? It's really any act that takes unfair advantage of the older adult's money or assets for the benefit of the perpetrator. And it doesn't matter how much money or how many assets they have. If it's someone taking your $5 and that's all you've got, that's just as serious or sometimes more serious than taking the $5,000 from someone else. So this includes not only just flat-out theft, but coercion. In a lot of cases, it includes moving in and just taking over, or borrowing money with no intent to repay the loan. Now, this isn't somebody who really does intend to repay a loan that they take out from their mom, but life intervenes. These are people who say, okay, well, Mom, I need a loan. They have absolutely no intention of ever repaying it. Believe it or not, that is considered financial exploitation and can be considered against the law. Misuse of a power of attorney, conservatorship, or guardianship, those are very, very common, where you get a power of attorney, a conservatorship, or a guardianship over an older adult and then misuse that for your own benefit, leaving the older adult wanting. We also see this happening with people who have representative payee status. And identity theft, you all know what identity theft is when we talk about it in the general population, when we talk about someone using your credit card or something like that. But when we see identity theft with these cases, usually what we're seeing is somebody who is utilizing the older adult's identity fraudulently to gain something. They sign their name fraudulently to a power of attorney, or they sign their name to a check, or they do something else that gives them power over that older adult. And then what is caregiver abuse? For some people it seems like these are very simple explanations, but I just want to be really clear that we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing. So caregiver abuse is any act, whether that's an act of omission, an exploitive act, whatever, any act perpetrated by a caregiver with the intention of causing or resulting in the victim experiencing pain, loss of independence, physical, medical, emotional, financial, psychological, or spiritual harm. So this is a pretty broad explanation. If you are in a caregiver role, whether that's a paid caregiver role or an unpaid caregiver role, like a family member or someone who's just helping out, if you have the intention of causing the pain, or whether you have the intention or not, and it results in that person experiencing those things, you have committed caregiver abuse. And what I'd like to point out is that I include psychological and spiritual harm in this. It's not just that the person experiences physical pain or physical loss, that there's a medical complication or a financial complication. Spiritual harm and psychological harm, emotional harm, those can sometimes be the most devastating thing. And then domestic violence is basically any type of violence, abuse, or threat of violence. And I would emphasize that the threat of violence is as serious as the actual act of violence. For a lot of older adults, the threat of violence is more serious or more threatening in their mind than the actual act of violence that one partner in a relationship commits against another partner. One of the things that I like to point out is that domestic violence is usually a pattern of behaviors. It's behaviors along a continuum. Usually it starts out with something relatively minor, maybe some snapping at a person, and then it escalates quickly to verbal abuse, possibly some medical abuse, withholding medications or over-medicating a person, and then it can move on to becoming physically violent, sexually violent. There are a huge number of behaviors that kind of fit into this pattern. And then what is caregiver domestic violence? Basically, this is domestic violence that gets perpetrated by someone who is both a caregiver and a partner. And, you know, the person that you should be able to trust the most in your life is your intimate partner. The person you should be able to trust the second most in your life is your caregiver. When that person is the same person and the abuse is taking place, you can imagine the level of betrayal that goes on. And then these crimes committed by a family member who is related by blood or marriage, who is also a caregiver, are sometimes by some police jurisdictions considered caregiver domestic violence. Okay. Now, a lot of people say, well, why are you talking about financial abuse when you're talking about caregiver abuse and caregiver violence? Well, sometimes we see the financial abuse, the financial exploitation as less violent or less important than somebody who gets smacked around or whose medications are denied them. But financial exploitation is one of the primary weapons that's used by these perpetrators to diminish the older person's resources and options. If you have your finances and your paid caregiver is abusing you, you can get a different caregiver. But if you have that financial option or that financial resource taken away from you, you don't have a lot of other resources. If it's a family member who's abusing you and you have your financial resources, you may be able to hire a professional. But if they've taken all of your money away from you, taken your home, taken your car, taken all of that independence, how will you afford to hire a professional caregiver? Financial exploitation is usually a first step or a tip of the iceberg that we see in more complex cases of abuse. And from a law enforcement perspective, it is absolutely the tip of the iceberg. If you see financial exploitation, you know that there's probably some other form of abuse going on and that it's time to dig a little bit deeper. So now I want to test your knowledge, see how well you know the issues of older adult abuse. So, don't worry, I'll give you the answers eventually. How many cases of caregiver abuse are investigated in Colorado each year? So just kind of write this down and see how well you came out in the end. A woman with a disability is what % more likely to be a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault than an able-bodied woman, regardless of her age? Now, this is about the abuse of older adults, but you'll find that there are a lot of similarities between some statistics for older adults and for people with disabilities. So who do you think perpetrates caregiver abuse more often? Professional caregivers or family members? What percentage of all crimes against people with developmental disabilities go unreported? And this is unreported to anybody, unreported to the police or to human services or to anyone who can do anything to intervene. And a lot of people with developmental disabilities are getting older. And so this may be something that you would see in your practice, an older adult with a developmental disability. Individuals who are classified as elderly is the fastest growing and largest population in the United States. In the 2004 census in Colorado, we had about 500,000 people with disabilities living in the state, and that includes older adults with disabilities. We believe that that number has probably almost doubled in our last census. About 75,000 people classified as able-bodied still report extreme challenges. So when you have an older adult who is classified as able-bodied because they don't have a diagnosable disability, they still may have some challenges in life. Challenges with meal preparation or bathing, challenges with driving, challenges with understanding their medications, all things that could require a caregiver, even if that's their daughter or their son who just helps out. They're still in a caregiver role. So here are some more of those stats for you to answer some of those questions. Only 7% of crimes perpetrated against people with cognitive disabilities are reported to the police. Now that includes people with dementia, only 7%. So when you think about the people that you are working with in your practice, think about how many of them have some sort of cognitive disability. Maybe it's the early stages of dementia, maybe it's an advanced stage Alzheimer's, maybe they had a traumatic brain injury. And know that if only 7% are reported to the police, that's a huge percentage of people who are being abused who never get that reported to anyone. 9 out of every 10 people with a disability will be abused in their lifetime. The risk of becoming a victim increases as you get older. And I believe that that statistic out of all of these is the most shocking to me. If we said 9 out of every 10 people were going to be a victim of something in any other place in life, it would be a cause for congressional action and for people to be up in arms. But we can say 9 out of every 10 people with a disability becomes abused, and we don't really do a lot about it. So you're the people who are doing something about it, and just kind of try to remember when you're working with people that a lot of people who may not be reporting abuse to you may still be experiencing abuse. 63% of all crimes against people with developmental disabilities go unreported. And here's another shocking stat, I think. A woman with a disability is 240% more likely to be a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault than an able-bodied woman, and that includes women of all ages. That is a huge difference. Financial exploitation by a caregiver is one of the fastest growing crimes in America. It happens in all financial strata. It happens across all ethnicities. It's not something that discriminates in any way. 50% of all adults in America will be victims of identity theft in their lifetime. Older adults with caregivers are at extremely high risk for identity theft. It's estimated that 1 in every 5 older adults will become a victim of abuse, and that term is pretty broad, abuse. In this case, it refers to 1 out of every 5 older adults self-reporting that someone in their life has abused them either physically, sexually, medically by denying medications or over-medicating them, or financially. Many older adults and people with disabilities fear caregiver abuse in hospitals and nursing facilities or group homes to such an extent that they would rather stay in a violent home than seek help or support. And I have to tell you, I see this all of the time. I've worked with many people who we've identified the victimization occurring in their home. We've identified that their caregiver, who also happens to be their son, is beating them on a regular basis, is withholding medications, is withholding food from them, is leaving them in deplorable, dirty conditions, not helping them change, not helping them bathe, leaving them in a filthy bed, perpetrating all of these horrific things, in many cases sexually assaulting them on a regular basis. But they are so fearful about the rumors they've heard about what could happen to them in a nursing home that they would rather stay with that abusive caregiver and suffer those indignities and those crimes day in and day out than trust a nursing facility or a hospital because of what they've heard. To me, I think that's horrifying. Hard for people to believe, but sexual assault is very common in cases of elder abuse. Some of the people that we have interviewed have indicated to us it's common enough that we can say as many as 90% of caregiver abuse cases involve some form of sexual abuse against the victim. And this includes family members who are sexually abusing the victim, children, grandchildren, male and female who are sexually abusing the victim. And then the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children tell us that there are more registered sex offenders in the U.S. than there are active duty police officers. This includes all law enforcement agencies, all ranks, everything. There are more sex offenders than there are police officers. So when people say, why do sex offenders get away with it? Why can they do it again and again? This is one of those many reasons. If we put one officer on every registered sex offender, we would still have quite a few sex offenders out there who are being unguarded. And many of these people who've been sexually abused are older adults. The Colorado Department of Human Services estimates that they receive about 11 to 12,000 viable reports of abuse perpetrated against older adults every year. When they say viable, they mean these are the reports that they believe enough that they investigate them. These are not the person who calls from an inpatient psych facility and says, I'm being held against my will by the aliens. These are people who the report is made and it is a believable report and needs to be investigated. That is a huge number of people in just one state in the United States who are being abused, especially when you go back and look at our stats that say that only 7% are reported, and this is our 7%, 11 to 12,000. It says a lot about our culture and the way that we treat our older adults. So I think everybody probably got this question right. Who perpetrates more often, professional caregivers or family members? Well, I think we all know that family members are more likely to perpetrate caregiver abuse than a professional caregiver. Not that professional caregivers are free of doing it, it's just that we know that family members do perpetrate. 75% of all reported cases involve a family member who is the abuser. This next statistic I threw in here just to let you know that there is a national registry, and so far there are over 100,000 people who are on that registry of people who have been found guilty. Now, these are not people who have been accused. These are people who have been found guilty of stealing drugs or perpetrating abuses against patients. So that's a lot of nurses and nurses' aides. I want to go over some myths about abuse in later life and then the truth about them, because I think this will give you a better picture of who is being abused and why. Caregiver abuse only happens in nursing homes. Now, that's a huge myth. The majority of caregiver abuse occurs in the home. It's usually perpetrated by someone the victim loves or someone they're related to. And when I say related to, they can be related to them by blood, it's their family, or they can be related by marriage, it's their son-in-law. And then if someone is abused by his or her adult child, it's because the victim was an abusive parent and therefore deserves to be abused. It's just payback. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. It is absolutely not true. Victims of caregiver abuse are victims. They don't deserve to be abused. It's not payback. No one deserves to be abused. And furthermore, it's really rare for a victim of child abuse to pay back the abuser. That dynamic, that power and control dynamic that we see between an abused child and the abusive parent, that maintains throughout life. Even when the abusive parent becomes less able to care for themselves, less able to defend themselves, less able to perpetrate, they still have that psychological position over the child so that they are still in a position in which they are the one who holds the power. So we don't really see this happening often. It's pretty frustrating that a lot of people write off older adult abuse as saying, well, yeah, it's probably just the kids getting back at them. Most caregiver abuse is caused by caregiver stress. We hear this all the time. It's really hard taking care of older adults. There's a lot of stress involved. There's financial stresses. There are physical stresses. It's not easy taking care of mom and taking care of my kids, and you just snap. The truth is that abuse is not a normal reaction to stress, and we don't see it very often. It is very rare that a caregiver will act out in violence because of stress. It does happen. It just doesn't happen as often as people would like us to believe. And then the myth, caregiver abuse is abuse and not a crime, and it really should be taken care of by a social worker, not a cop. We hear this all the time. We hear this from police officers, and we hear this from the community. When a caregiver is involved, they're abusing the person. That's something that social services should do. Call a social worker. Don't call a cop. But the truth is, caregiver abuse is a crime. It's against the law in Colorado. It's against the law in every state in the United States. It is a crime, and law enforcement needs to be called and they need to intervene. Now, they might work with social workers as part of a response team. They may contact a caseworker to do some of the follow-up and to get that person stabilized, but it does need to be treated as a crime, and that person who perpetrates it does need to be treated as a criminal. The next myth, people should feel sorry for the caregiver. Honestly, I don't have a lot of sympathy. A person who uses violence against another person, they're a criminal. And when they use violence against a person who is unable to defend themselves, they're even more of a criminal. The next myth, only a professional paid caregiver can perpetrate caregiver abuse. And as you all know, family members, partners are much more often the ones who are perpetrating that kind of abuse. And here's another myth that we hear a lot is that older adults and people with disabilities, they just lack the ability to make decisions for themselves. And they need to have caregivers who make their choices for them. And when we judge a caregiver and call them abusive, we're wrong. Those caregivers are just trying to help. And the truth is that older adults and people with disabilities have the same rights to self-determination that you and I have, and that caregivers are there to help guide the choices and to help make that a little bit easier for the person, but they're not there to take over. In some cases, when the person does lack the ability to make decisions for themselves, the caregiver should be in a position in which they assist in a way that serves the wants and the needs of that older adult. It's so important, and your role in their lives can be so important when the person has all of their mental capacities and their cognitive abilities to kind of lay out what that looks like and what that means, so that if they do lose the ability to make decisions for themselves, people will know exactly what it is that they would have wanted. And you can tell if that's something that the person would want or something that they would not want. And maybe, what mom would really want is to have her favorite son and his kids move in and take over the household. But maybe that's the last thing that mom would want. And it's important to hear that from her before she's unable to make that decision for herself. Identity theft only happens to young people who use the internet. Well, the truth is that identity theft can happen to anyone at any time, and less than 10% of ID thefts are perpetrated online. One of the things that puts older adults at extremely high risk is having a caregiver. Caregivers have access to everything in their lives, and it's pretty easy for them to take over their identity. The difference is that if it's a traditional identity thief, they're after your money or they're after your ID for credit purposes. When it's perpetrated by a caregiver against an older adult, they usually will wipe out the older adult, and there isn't anybody there who can help report that and make that difference for them. So what kind of impact does abuse have on victims? It's very serious, and it can have some serious ramifications in the life of the victim. A woman who has been a leader in the older adult abuse community, Pat Stannis, gave me the following quote. Unfortunately, Pat has passed away and is no longer with us, but I think that what she says sums up the impact that these crimes can have on older adults. And I know that you all can read this for yourselves, but I'm going to read it anyway since this is being recorded. I just want to make sure that the impact of it is felt. Perpetrators of adult mistreatment very often groom their potential victims in various ways to gain their trust, their respect, and in many cases their love. When the victimization occurs, it is much less likely that a groomed victim will report it or will support law enforcement in pursuing the criminal charges. The victim does not want others to know about the situation due to shame and embarrassment. The victim may be in denial or in shock about the betrayal by a friend, a family member, or a lover. These dynamics assure that the victim is not only criminally violated, but is also left feeling betrayed at a deeply personal level. With this vulnerable population, such trauma can significantly impact the victim's ability to function on a daily level, has long-term negative impact on the person's medical health and cognitive functioning, and in some cases can result in the person dying much sooner than would have been the case prior to the incident. So I want to go back over a little bit of this. Perpetrators groom their victims. What that means is that these caregiver perpetrators, family members or professional caregivers who are part of this older adult's life, they don't just walk in one day. If your home is burglarized, the burglars just show up one day and burglarize your home. If your purse is snatched, they just catch you at the grocery store, snatch your purse, and they're gone. These perpetrators, there is intent and there is a long-term commitment. They spend time gaining that older adult's trust, making sure that person considers them a trusted other, someone in their life that they can turn to, someone that loves them, someone that they love. In some cases, that is a family member. It's a son-in-law who gains the trust of mom. Or it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend of one of the kids who gains that trust. Sometimes it's a complete stranger, a professional caregiver, someone they met at the grocery store, something like that, who just shows that they can be trusted. First, they start out by coming over and changing the light bulbs in your outside lamps, and then they're doing this little errand for you and that little errand for you, and then pretty soon they've kind of moved in on you. Sometimes it's a love interest. This is especially true for older adults who've just lost someone that they love and has been their life partner. They're very vulnerable to these romance scammers who just walk in and, I love you, you are my life, you are so wonderful, please share your life with me. And what they really mean is, please let me in and let me have all your stuff. So then, once you've been kind of groomed to that, that's when the abuse starts trickling in, a little bit at a time, and eventually it escalates and gets worse and worse and worse. At that time, this person who's been groomed isn't going to report you. They love you. You are their love interest. You are their son-in-law who's like the son they never had. You're the person who, when their kids all tried to tell them they needed to go to a nursing home, was there and told them they could stay at home. So you're the person who is there for them that they love. No matter how much you abuse them, it's very hard for them to go ahead and report that. And if someone else reports it, it's unlikely that they're going to tell law enforcement what you've done. They'll most likely tell the officer, oh, he just has a bad temper and things get out of control sometimes, but I'm fine. Or, well, I really caused that myself. It wasn't them. It's my fault. I take responsibility. They really don't want other people to know about what happened. And oftentimes, I love that she says they may be in denial or shock, because shock makes you do strange things. When you are in denial or in shock, it's really hard for you to act on it and to tell law enforcement the truth, or to ask for help, or to tell your daughter who's not offending, who comes in from Wisconsin to visit, your brother and his wife moved in and they're abusing me. So one of the things that I wanted to point out about the rest of what Pat said is that this does have long-term negative impacts on their ability to function on a daily basis. Their medical health, it just deteriorates quickly. Their cognitive functioning, even though there may not be anything wrong with this person's cognitive abilities, their ability to think, their ability to concentrate, their ability to make rational decisions is diminished by the grief and the trauma and the betrayal. And in some cases, we have seen people who their doctors are telling us, she shouldn't have died. We don't know why she did. And it was, 10 years or so before they thought that they should have passed away. But it's all connected to this abuse. So for older adults, trauma might look a little bit different than it does with younger people. Those kind of trauma responses, the denial, the sense of betrayal, it can look very different. And if you're seeing these things with people that you're working with, you might want to consider that it could possibly be that person is a victim of abuse of some sort. First is the decline in health, and that can be physical health or mental health. Now, some of that is a natural part of aging, and some of that is maybe related to a disease, but it could also be related to abuse. And then that loss of independence. Now, we all know that there are some older adults who shouldn't be driving, and that's just a natural part of getting older. But they're still pretty active. They're very connected in their community. They found a way to get around not being able to drive. But if suddenly you see someone who no longer goes to church, who no longer does their own shopping, who starts isolating a little bit at a time, then you know that that might possibly be a victim of abuse. The loss of their home savings and means of support, clearly something that should be and some indicative of some kind of abuse going on in their life. If they have guilt, shame, embarrassment, and it doesn't seem to be connected to anything, then you might want to check and see how much is going on. If you can imagine, a lot of older adults who are being abused by their children are so shamed that their child is doing this and feel so guilty that they must have raised a child some way incorrectly, that they're behaving this way, that they're just too embarrassed and too shamed to share that with someone. Depression in older adults, now sometimes that depression is just a part of, their friends have all died and their spouse has passed away and they don't have their vision and their hearing in the same way they used to, but sometimes depression is related to being abused. And you usually see an increase in suicidal ideation among people who are being abused. That kind of mental confusion, again, it could be a part of their disease pattern, but it could also be related to being exposed to crime on a daily basis. And their decline in their ability to perform important daily living tasks like getting up, brushing their teeth, feeding themselves, those things may be because they just lack the interest in caring for themselves anymore because of the abuse. The refusal of medical attention, I think this should always be something that is a red flag for someone, that there could possibly be some abuse. If you are denying that you need to take your insulin or that you need medical attention for your heart disease. And that goes along with taking the prescribed medications. But we also see overuse of prescribed meds or over-the-counter meds. We do see some alcohol and drug abuse. Didn't used to see any kind of drug abuse in older adults, but now that we've got baby boomers who are getting into that category, drugs are something that they might turn to as a way of compensating and self-medicating for the pain. One of the things that you do see in some of the older adults, the 75 plus older adults, is the sense of escapism. The TV's on all the time, and they believe that characters from TV and books are real, and they're just waiting for someone to come and save them. I worked with one older adult who was being physically and sexually abused by her son and physically and medically abused by her daughter-in-law on a pretty regular basis. The couple had moved in on them. The son started beating her up and then as a way of controlling her a little bit more, would sexually assault her. The daughter-in-law would over-medicate or under-medicate her and slap her around as well. And when I talked with her, when the police were finally called in by a neighbor, and when I went with the officers and when we arrived, she told us that she had been waiting for Gibbs from NCIS to discover what was going on with her and come and rescue her, because she was a Navy veteran, and she knew that somehow he would figure out what was going on. She was sending him messages, intellectual messages or psychic messages, when she was watching NCIS on Tuesday or Wednesday nights, whatever that is. To her, that was very real. She really believed that someone was going to come and rescue her. And when we came, she didn't want to talk to us until we fed into that and said, yes, we were sent by Gibbs. He asked us to come and intervene for you. You also see some self-neglect. Some self-neglect is a person's choice and their decision, but some of it can be related to abuse. And we kind of go on. These are all things that I think you'll probably see at some point in time. Loss of trust. And that loss of trust, that can be anyone and everyone. The priest that they've always trusted, the neighbors, not just the perpetrator. That fear, hopelessness, delusions, outbursts of anger, withdrawal from activities, isolative behaviors, all of those things can indicate abuse. Sometimes there are some unclear and confusing efforts to stop the abuse. They may call the police and say something's wrong, but not be able to exactly say what it is that's wrong. They may have bouts of crying or cry every day. They may ask for help, but not be able to define what help they need. Calling law enforcement and saying, there's just problems, there's just troubles, I don't know what to say, or telling us that there's the man who is outside the bedroom at night, or giving us some vague information. Those are all indications of abuse. So I want to take just a couple minutes to talk a little bit about how violence is different in later life, and then I want to leave enough time for us to have some questions. So in later life, there's a higher risk of injury. It's much more difficult to recuperate from injury, and the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator is usually much more intense, and the victim is much more dependent. Systems, including human services, are often perceived as the enemy by the victim instead of the person who may be there to help them. Medications can make it more threatening for a person to be abused. A lot of blood thinners can mean that a person will bleed out quickly if they're hit and get a cut, so there can be some serious complications there. Threats are perceived as very likely to be realized. When you're younger, people can threaten you, and sometimes you believe them and sometimes you don't. But most older adults, if you say to them, next time you try that, I'm just going to kill you, they believe, next time that happens, I'm going to die. The caregiver withholding care and withholding affection, this is a really cruel form of abuse, and it's really hard to report this to anybody. My son just won't hug me. He won't tell me he loves me. He shows no affection for me whatsoever. That is devastating to a lot of these victims and a really good measure of control. If you do exactly what I tell you to do and you give me your money and you do this, I'll tell you I love you. So it's a huge, huge form of control that you don't always see you do in some domestic violence relationships, but you don't always see that in younger adults. And then there's something called the power and control model, and that's very different for older adults. The power and control model is when we talk about domestic violence and how domestic violence looks in this country, and we talk about things like physical violence, sexual violence, and some of the ways that in traditional domestic violence relationships, someone exerts power and control over another person, using coercion, using threats, using intimidation, using abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying and blaming, using the children, using their male privilege, using economics. All of these are ways that they exert power and control over the victim. For older adults, we've asked them what their power and control cycle would look like, and this is what they showed us, or told us. Those things are still there. All of those other forms of abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the violence, but look at the way this power and control model differs. Every single axis is psychological or emotional abuse. For older adults, it doesn't matter if it's financial exploitation, if it's physical assault, if it's sexual assault, the emotional and the psychological abuse trumps it. That's the abuse that hurts the most. And we do see some things that are a little bit different. Financial exploitation, threats, those are kind of the same, but we see that they target their vulnerabilities and they neglect them, that they deny access to their spiritual traditions. You don't go to church anymore. You can't go to synagogue. I'm sorry, I know that you've always practiced the traditions around Rosh Hashanah, but we're not going to let you do that this year. They ridicule not only your personal values, but your cultural values as well. They can use other family members. You know, if you don't give me your money, you're not ever going to see your grandchild again. Those kinds of things. The isolation is huge, and the use of their privilege in the domestic violence model, you saw that it was mostly male privilege. In this model, it's just the able-bodied privilege. I'm the one with a car. I'm the one who's doing the work. I'm the one who can do this. And you're not. You're nothing. And that emotional abuse is huge. Here you can see them side by side, and I think that what this points out most clearly is that what I've just been saying, emotional and psychological abuse for older adults, that is the worst. I have worked with some people who have said, I wish my son would just hit me. If he would hit me, I could understand it. It's this day in and day out, belittling me, making fun of me, not saying he loves me, not showing any care for me, just abusing me. Everything I do is wrong. It's always my fault. Anything that happens in his life, it's my fault. He gets a flat tire, it's my fault. Anything that happens, it's my fault. And that kind of psychological abuse is devastating. It wears the person down. And you all know that being worn down and exhausted emotionally causes huge impact in your life physically. So before I go to answering the questions, just want to say, you know, what is it that you can do about it? It seems like an overwhelming issue. Well, the best thing that you can do is to educate yourself and others. And then you can work to make whatever services you provide accessible to older adults and people with disabilities. And I don't just mean physically accessible. You have a ramp or you have an elevator. What I mean is that older adults need to feel safe talking to you and comfortable talking to you. They need to feel that you're not just another one of those younger adults who's going to say to them, oh, you poor thing, and then send them right back to the abusive relationship. They have to know that they can trust you, and part of that is saying, I don't have the answer. I don't know what you can do if the police come and take your son. I don't know how you will get to your doctor's appointments. At least you're honest with them. But if you say, I don't know, but I'm willing to work on some options with you, let's think about some choices that you might have, let's come up with some ideas, then they're going to trust you a lot more than if you say, oh, don't worry, we'll just take it, we'll take care of all of it. I'm sure there's services out there. If you say, I'm going to help you find them, it builds trust right away. And learning about the resources in your community. You can seek out some models in your community. I know we have quite a few here in Colorado, and I don't know what other states are represented here, but there are quite a few of them in California. Wisconsin has quite a few, and I know some of the East Coast states, especially New York, have quite a few models that for interacting with older adults and stopping abuse and reporting to the police and that sort of thing. And then ensure that the voices of victims with disabilities and older adults are heard. You can be their mouthpiece. You can speak for them at your legislatures. You can speak for them in your communities. If you don't know the answers, ask the experts. If you know a crime's occurred, report it. And then work collaboratively with the people in your community to have a systemic response to older adults being abused, not just one or two people trying to intervene. And then basically you can just make a difference one person at a time. So I think that's all that I have for today. I know it felt like I talked really fast, but I wanted to make sure you got at least a little bit of information, and I am willing to take questions now. Here's my email and phone number again. If you would prefer to email me your questions or give me a call or just schedule a time to have a conversation, I'm available. So thank you all so much for coming in. I'll take some questions now.
Okay, great, Hazel, and as I will speak on behalf of everybody, thank you for this excellent presentation. This is such an important topic, and just so everybody is aware, as I'm sure we will have some questions come in, we will make sure we have these slides available with the recorded presentation, so we'll make sure to email that out to everybody. If you came in late today, you will notice on the right-hand side of your screen there is a questions box. If you have any questions that you would like Hazel to answer, now is the time to go ahead and put those in there, or else you can email Hazel or you can email the Society, and we will make sure to get those questions over to her. Hazel, I do have a couple here. The first one I believe you may have touched on. I'll go ahead and ask this again. Is there a national organization for oversight to elder abuse?
There are a couple of organizations, but oversight is a little bit tricky because so many states have different laws. There is not someone who oversees how elder abuse is, like there's no one like, the EPA would be, or something like that, that oversees elder abuse in every single state. But there are some national organizations, and I'll be happy to get some of those names out, and names and contacts out to you, Erica, to just get out to everybody. There are some national organizations that deal with the issues of elder abuse. Oversight, it's a little tricky because, like I said, each state has a different set of laws. But I will get some resources out to Erica about some national organizations that do education and take reports from different states to kind of track the types of elder abuse that we're seeing state to state.
Okay, wonderful. That would be great, Hazel, and we will make sure once you send that over, we'll add that kind of as an entire package with this presentation and send out to all of our CSAs here. Another question that I have here, should all caregivers be mandated reporters? I think that would help.
Again, that depends on the state that you live in, whether you are a mandated reporter or not. In Colorado, as up until July 1st of this year, you were not a mandated reporter by the nature of being a caregiver. If you were a nurse caregiver, you may have been mandated under your nursing license, or you may have been mandated as a home health care worker, but mandated reporting was not part of the elder abuse laws. And I believe that with the exception of about 5 or 6 states, now every state in the U.S. is a mandated reporting state, and usually caregivers are included as mandated reporters. And I agree with that person. It definitely would help. The challenge that we have is that that can only cover people who have a professional caregiver status, and the majority of caregivers are family members who are in a non-professional capacity. I think if they're caregivers who are being paid through home and community-based services with the Departments of Human Services, they may be considered a mandated reporter in most states, but if they're just a family member who's taking care of mom, they don't have a professional organization that requires that they're reporting. But I agree. When caregivers report, it makes a huge difference. And what I would suggest is contacting your local, for those of you who are not in Colorado, to contact your state's Department of Human Services and ask them who's listed as a mandated reporter. And if it says caregiver, ask them to define that, because the law will have defined what a caregiver is in great detail. And it will tell you what professions of caregivers are required to report and what teeth the law has. If you don't report, what happens? In some states, you could lose your license. In other states, you get a slap on the wrist. So you want to know what your state has, not only for mandated reporters, but sanctions if they don't report.
Okay, great, Hazel. I've got one more here, and this statement is from Mary, and she says here that these statistics are alarming, especially about the perpetrators that gain the trust of the elderly first and then later abuse them either physically or financially. Those of us listening with the society are truly advocates for the elderly, and we want to do everything we can to honor and care for the elderly. That is our mission. But what can we do to represent ourselves in such a way to reassure older adults and families that we really are to be trusted when there are so many that should not be trusted? We abide by a professional code of ethics, but is that enough?
Wow. I don't know if I have enough time to answer that question in the next hour, but I would say thank you for that comment, because you're absolutely correct. I believe that there are some organizations that are perceived as being more trustworthy than others. One of the things, and I'm so sorry to say this, but in my experience this is the truth, one of the things that you can do to make yourself trusted a little bit more is to distance yourself from nursing facilities or from anyone who is a facility of any sort where an older adult might go. And that doesn't mean you keep those people off of any coalitions that you work or anything, just that when you talk to an older adult or when you represent yourself to an older adult, you make clear to them that it is not your goal to put them in a nursing facility or in an assisted care facility, that it is your goal to maintain independence to the level that they desire and are capable of, and that you are there to support their self-determination. That's going to be huge in the eyes of an older adult, and that's going to gain a lot of trust. Another thing that could gain trust for them, and again it depends on the community in which the older adults live themselves and what their cultural background is, but having an association with law enforcement can sometimes help you be more trustworthy, because they know that we do background checks and that, you know, we're not criminals working for law enforcement, and so sometimes that can help. In some communities who have mistrust of law enforcement, that's not always the best option, but that can certainly help. If you have a physical environment in which older adults may come for some reason, just making sure that that environment does things to indicate that you believe in older adult independence. Maybe you have great pictures on the wall of older adults who are out having a blast doing fun things instead of pictures of older adults sitting in a rocking chair, you know, at a nursing facility. Now, I'm not saying that that's what people have on their walls, but I'm just trying to make a kind of dramatic difference there. And that I think the best way to build trust is just to be trustworthy. If you can demonstrate through stories in the media, through anecdotal stories, people that they know in their community that have used your services and have trusted you and have had a positive result, that makes a big difference. You know, getting somebody in your local media to do a great story about you and airing it during the times that older adults listen to the news. So the early news, the morning news, the 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock news as opposed to the 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock news. Having them air those stories, but make sure that it's someone that they trust in the media. A lot of us don't trust the media, but almost everybody trusts their consumer reporter because they believe that while the other media people may be lying to them, that consumer reporter cares about them and cares about making sure that they are doing good. You know, maybe if you have an older person who's the well-loved weatherman in your community, you could try to get that person to make comments or do some sort of an endorsement. I think those things help. If you have brochures or some information that you can put in the bathrooms at doctor's offices where they see a lot of older adults, or in hospital emergency room restrooms where they see a lot of older adults, anything where they can see that your information is connected to something that they trust. Most of them, they'll go to the doctor, they'll go to the emergency room. They know that the medical profession on the whole is there to help them. And if you can have something that is somehow associated with them, I love my doctor, I trust my doctor. Oh, he has a brochure from these people here. Well, that must make them trustworthy too. I think those are all the kinds of things that you can do. And if you'd like to email me or give me a call, maybe we could talk about some other options for appearing more trustworthy to older adults. That is a great question.
Okay, great, Hazel, and I agree. Definitely a great question. And like Hazel mentioned, if you guys have any more questions like this, please feel free to email her, or you can email them over to us, and we'll make sure to get them to Hazel. We are going to create this Q&A document that we'll attach with an entire package with the slides from today and everything, so we'll make sure to get that out to you. We are on the hour, so that is all we have time for, but Hazel, again, excellent presentation, important topic, and we can't thank you enough for joining us today and providing this information to us. Just for all of you who are interested in seeing some other presentations that Hazel has provided for us in the past, you can find those on the CSA portal going through the website, the CSA website. Hazel has presented on also protecting seniors from fraud and ID theft, and also why elders are targets for scams and financial abuse. If you can't seem to locate those, please just shoot us an email and we can make sure to email the links for those over to you. One quick heads up on the webinar for October that has been scheduled for Friday, October 18th, and we are going to be joined by Dr. Greg Hinrichsen, and he is going to present on seniors and depression. This will cover what is late life depression, what are the common triggers for depression in older adults, case examples of older adults treated for depression, and in what settings do older adults receive treatment for depression. So you can go ahead and register for that through the CSA website. And again, we will get this recorded presentation out to you when we have it available. And Hazel, thanks again so much. We truly appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Perfect. We'll see everybody next time.